We employ more than 80 people who work for us all around the world, and yet 0 of them are Americans and 0 of them live in the United States. Today, I'm going to tell you 5 reasons why. These 5 reasons are important if you're an employer, particularly if you're an employer who has moved your business offshore, the way we help our clients do. But I think it's also important to understand just the social context of why Americans are at a disadvantage, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But the 5 reasons come down to costs, taxes, regulations, quality, and attitude. And so let's look at the costs of the salaries. The U.S. has, depending on the way you look at it, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th highest wages in the world. And I've said before, that's the best reason to be a U.S. citizen. I think it's a less important reason than ever because people can work from anywhere in the world. You can get a job, you can get a freelance deal, and you can live somewhere else. And outside of a few Gulf countries, they're not going to check your passport if you sound and talk and write like an American. But being a U.S. citizen, of course, allows you to live and work in the United States and take advantage of that labor market with those higher wages. And so for a company like ours, which can hire people anywhere, why do we want to go and pay the 3rd or 4th or 5th highest wages? It's as simple as that. U.S. salaries are some of the highest out there. People in Europe earn lower salaries generally. Now that's partially because people in Europe often get paid net, which means whatever they get, they put in their pocket, and then the employer pays the taxes on top of that. Those can be insane in a country like Belgium. I mean, the employer might be paying twice as much of what the employee is actually getting. And so if you can hire someone in the United States where all you're paying is a low Social Security, low Medicare contribution, you're not going to be able to pay someone in Europe as much if you're an international company. And that's actually one of the things that the U.S. is good at. The costs to the employer of hiring someone are low among most countries where we look at, but net, it's still one of the more expensive places to hire. The next issue, and this is probably the biggest one for a company like ours, is taxes. And this is what a lot of people who move their company overseas or just who have international companies don't realize. And that is where you have people working for you could be a negative tax factor. So if you move your company offshore, and if you move offshore, you can reduce your taxes dramatically. We help people do it all the time. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. If you've got a business, learn how we can help you move your company offshore legally. We want to do it legally. But one of the things that people don't often consider is, let's say they're an American and they move overseas and they set their company up in a 0 tax jurisdiction. Now they as an American may have some small tax obligations, but they're still going to pay a lot less. But then they say, oh, I've got my U.S. employees. I'm going to have them keep working for the company. They don't realize that that drags their foreign company back into the U.S. tax net. And we're not going to get into too many complications because there's a lot of different ways this can work. But theoretically, their entire company could be taxed as if it's a U.S. company because they have that U.S. presence. Depends on what those people do, depends on how many there are. There's a lot of different factors. So this is not tax advice, but just suffice it to say that if you have people working for you in the United States en masse, that can be a problem. If you have people doing certain jobs, that's more likely to always be a problem. And so when you move your company overseas, you want to look at where you actually put those people working for you. And at the very least, you want to get some tax advice from qualified international tax experts, the kind that we work with, who will say, okay, maybe this person can do a job, but those 5 can't. And so then the question is, if you have Americans working for you, do they want to relocate outside of the United States? Most people don't, and I'll come back to that also in a moment. Now, I don't have any great sadness for having to replace Americans. I left the country. I don't feel that just because I'm from there that I owe those people my money. Obviously, it's never nice to tell someone who does a good job, hey, you don't have a job because I'm moving my company overseas. But if you can save a lot of money, I'm never going to feel that just because you're from a place that you owe the people down the street income, especially if you say, hey, come with me to wherever I'm moving, and they say no. The tax cost of hiring people in the United States is simply too high. And so you'll hear, and I remember growing up in the United States, you would hear ads, oh, this is a politician that gives tax breaks for hiring people overseas. I always thought that was a little bit disingenuous, kind of understanding how it actually works. But in a sense, yeah, I mean, the U.S. disincentivizes foreign companies actually hiring people in the U.S. I'm not talking about some big European company where they set up like a proper big office in the U.S. and they move the money between all the different. I'm talking about someone who runs a small business, as I do. You've got 80 people. Could you do something along those lines and keep some U.S. people? Yeah, but we've maybe. But why go through that hassle to keep a handful of Americans. If you're going to move your business overseas, and this is not just applying to the U.S. I mean, there's certain countries in Europe that make it really difficult as well, like Germany, for example. It's probably not the best idea to have people working for you in Germany. Whether you're an American moving overseas and you just hire a German as a freelancer, or whether you are a German and you're moving overseas and taking your company with you. So the U.S. isn't the only country that does this, but it is one of the ones that does make it harder in general. So the tax costs, not the Social Security and the other employer benefits that you pay, but the actual cost to your company. If you're going to move your company offshore, then why do you want to hire people who are going to drag you back into the tax net? Regulations in the U.S. aren't the worst in terms of labor law. They're also not the best. And so, certainly you can fire people in the U.S., probably one of the easiest places in the world to fire people. Certainly compared to European countries, the U.S. Is a dream to hire just in terms of the regulatory aspect and being able to replace people and the things that you can do. But there are other countries where the regulations are less strict. And I'm not saying in terms of you can mistreat people, but you do hear stories in the U.S. Someone goes to the office and someone tells the wrong joke, and now they're being sued for $10 million. You don't find that in places around the world. And so for me, you want to treat people well. You also don't want to have totally suffocating regulatory environment where someone just gets a little bit upset and they go and cause a problem. For our company in particular, quality is an issue. And I'm not saying that Americans aren't good workers. I think that one of the things that honestly I have changed on since leaving the U.S., people of my political persuasion perhaps would say, oh, these Americans, they're so lazy. In the grand scheme of things, there are countries where people are harder working, and there are countries where people are much lazier. I don't think that Americans are the laziest people in the world by far. For our particular business, we help people get second passports. We help people get residence permits. That involves sometimes, getting visas, and we talk about where you can travel with your new passport, and we talk about, tax planning, and we just deal with all kinds of exotic countries all around the world. And what we found is there's certain places in the world, Eastern and Central and Eastern Europe being one of them, where people just really seem to have a better knowledge of history and geography and geopolitics, and many of them have an experience where they had to get a visa to go to somewhere. And they understand what it's like to not have the world's best passport. I mean, the U.S. is barely in the top 50, but Americans think they have the best passport. And so we found that hiring in places, now we've had more success in the last year or so in Latin America. People have some of the same things. And so for a business like ours, where we need to be very international, not just the U.S., but to some extent the U.K., Ireland. We have some great Irish people. But some of those Western countries, the English-speaking Western countries, there's much less of a knowledge of what happens outside their country. They don't travel as much. They certainly don't go to the kind of exotic places that we do. But when you go and talk to someone in Georgia or in Serbia or in Venezuela, they know what's going on in the world on a global sense more. What's kind of crazy is I talk to a lot of Americans, and we've talked about Nomad Capitalist Live. It's our annual event. And people say, why don't you host it in Las Vegas? There'd be a lot of great places in Las Vegas. I do have some of the same concerns about tax risk, but the biggest issue is people who work for us getting visas. And you talk to the average American and sometimes the average British or Irish or Australian person, well, what are you talking about? They're just visiting. Yeah, if you're from Georgia or Serbia or Venezuela, you need a visa to go to the United States just to set foot for 1 minute, just to fly through, right? A Venezuelan who's flying from Caracas to Madrid through Newark, they need a visa just to get off the plane and go to the next one. So people don't understand that. And, it's harder for our business to have folks where, we're in the visa and residence and citizenship business where, we're not even starting at that level. When you go to the countries where we've historically hired, they get that kind of thing. Now, we've expanded into some of the more friendly Western countries where we can do business, and they want our business in a way more than what the United States wants our business. A country like Ireland, for example, makes it much easier to do this than the U.S. would. Some of the people we talk to in Ireland have the same issue, but it does seem to be a bigger issue in the U.S. I don't think that the quality of U.S. workers is as bad as some people in the U.S. think, so I'll give the U.S. that credit. So write it down. I do give the U.S. credit where it's due. I think there's plenty of good workers in the U.S. There's also plenty of good workers everywhere in the world. And so if I can get quality at a lower cost, with less regulation, with less tax risk, that not only gives me more room to bump people up, right? If I hire an American for $80,000, I have less room to bump their salary up than someone in Georgia who is, just as experienced, but they want 30,000. If they come back to me later and say, hey, now I need 50,000, all right, well, that's an easier discussion than the guy who wants to go from 80 to 100. So the quality for our business was less. And then the last thing is attitude. Certainly, I think that there is a greater sense of entitlement, particularly in English-speaking Western countries, probably in Western countries in general. I was recently in Cairo, and my goodness, one of the best service cultures you've ever seen. People are so attuned to help you. And I have friends who hire in places like Pakistan and India. It's like these people, they work so hard. They want to work. They want to get ahead. I will even say that, we find great Georgians to work for us because we've got our HR team is Georgian. But there's probably a lot of people in Georgia who just aren't that motivated. We find the good ones because we know that culture very well. But if you gave me a choice to hire all Georgians or all Pakistanis, I'll take all Pakistanis all day because, life in Georgia isn't that bad. Pakistan gets so many people. It's not 3.7 million people. It's a lot. It's 250 million people. People want to get ahead. There's a fire in the belly. And I think that's the kind of attitude that you'll find overseas. We wouldn't go to a country like Pakistan or Egypt to hire people because they're super duper cheap, because we wouldn't want the super duper cheap people there. I mean, talented people are still going to cost something no matter where you go, because we can all make money online now. But the attitude of yes, I want to get ahead in those countries might be higher in some cases. And so, humans in general, I have a tendency to be lazy. I'm not here to pick on the U.S. in general, but why would you pay more for that? Why would you take on more tax and regulation for that? And yeah, I think that there is a sense of cluelessness that Western countries have been allowed to have, a sense of entitlement, a sense of any number of things. And so that's why we don't hire Americans. It's not because I hate Americans. It's because the country makes it too difficult for me to work there. And so I follow my own 5 magic words: go where you're treated best. We have increasingly been hiring folks either in or from Western countries where we can set up structures. We do pay a little bit of tax to those countries, and we certainly pay all the required taxes to employ someone in a country like Ireland. But it's much easier for us. The U.S. is one of the hardest places for us to hire. And I'll add this: if the people who work in Georgia and Pakistan and Egypt and Venezuela needed to go and work with the folks in the U.S., again, they wouldn't be able to get a visa, in all cases at least, to go there. And would the Americans want to go to Venezuela? Or would the attitude be, oh my God, what's happening in Venezuela? We get our team together once every year for the Citizen Summit. I've just found it's harder to get Americans to travel overseas. It's certainly harder to get them to relocate. And we've just found it's easier to find people who are more in line with what we do. That's going to be different for every business, but certainly, costs and regulations and taxes should be something that every business considers. And if you've already moved your business offshore, you should consider where your employees are based. It's something that we help our clients do. We just did a big project researching the tax costs of hiring in a number of different countries. And it's something that you can tap into our experience. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Learn how we can help you not only move your business offshore and reduce your tax burden, but make sure that there aren't unknown unknowns that you're missing, like where your employees live.